Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome, everyone. Ready for a deep dive into something you might not expect? We're talking about the economic ambitions of Adolf Hitler and Fidel Castro.
Yeah, you might be thinking, Hitler and Castro? What could those two possibly have in common when it comes to economics?
Right. It's not the most obvious pairing.
Okay.
And to be clear, we are not drawing any kind of moral equivalence here.
Absolutely not. The point is to explore a fascinating historical pattern, what happens when leaders try to create completely self-sufficient nations.
Can it even be done?
That's the crux of it, this idea of autarky. Both Hitler and Castro were drawn to it. It's seductive, this idea that a nation can stand alone.
Produce everything it needs. Answer to no one.
Exactly. Control over your own destiny, your resources, your economic system, it's powerful, especially in the right historical context.
Which is key, right? Because Hitler comes to power in 1933, right in the middle of the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Germany's economy is in ruins. People are desperate.
And he promises to restore German pride, make it strong.
Make it self-reliant. Part of that was, I guess, this idea that a strong Germany had to be economically independent.
Absolutely. He wanted to free Germany from what he saw as, the shackles of international finance, dependence on foreign goods.
But it wasn't just about, economic stability, right? This drive for autarky, at least for Hitler. It was also tied to this idea of war and expansion.
For sure. You can't exactly conquer territory and create this Lebensraum, this living space, if you're reliant on your enemies for resources.
Makes sense. If you're going to launch a war, you can't have your war machine grind to a halt because you're suddenly cut off from, oil or steel or whatever.
Exactly. He needed Germany to be self-sufficient to wage war effectively.
So self-sufficiency as a means to an end, and a very dark end at that. Now, Castro's revolution in Cuba in 1959, that's a different story.
On the surface, yeah, Castro's all about overthrowing Batista, breaking free from U.S. influence.
Which, to be fair, had a pretty tight grip on the Cuban economy at the time, right? Especially the sugar industry.
Absolutely. And that's where this drive for autarky takes on a different flavor. For Castro, it was about national pride, about shedding this legacy of colonialism.
Taking control of their own destiny.
Right. He truly believed that economic independence was the only path to true independence.
But to do that, he had to make some pretty radical changes, right? Like nationalizing industries is no small thing.
Oh, it was huge. Imagine you're just a regular Cuban citizen going to work one day, and suddenly, boom, the government owns the company.
That's wild. So both leaders are going for this centralized control of their economies. But their methods were pretty different, right?
Oh, yeah. Hitler was all about rapid industrialization. His four-year plan in 1936, all about rearmament, even if it meant sacrificing, well, pretty much everything else.
The infamous guns over butter approach. It's crazy how he was willing to put the German people through that just to achieve this, twisted vision.
It's a stark reminder that economic growth without, thinking about the people, it's meaningless.
Totally. So what about Castro? Did his version of, I guess, socialist economics actually work?
It's complicated. On the one hand, Cuba saw some big improvements. Literacy rates went way up. Healthcare became accessible to everyone.
Wow, those are some major wins. Yeah. It sounds like he really was dedicated to social equality, at least in those areas.
He was. His government invested heavily in education and healthcare. They weren't privileges, they were rights. And it made a real difference in people's lives.
But we can't forget about the Soviet Union, right? They were pumping a lot of money into Cuba.
Right, that's the other side of the coin. As much as Castro wanted Cuba to be independent, they were still reliant on the Soviets.
Trading one form of dependence for another. Fascinating.
Right. And this is where things get even more interesting, because we already know that both Hitler and Castro, despite wanting to be totally self-sufficient,
they both ended up relying on other countries.
It's quite the paradox.
And it's what we'll be digging into next. But before we move on, I want to rewind a bit. Did their policies even work? Did they actually achieve what they set out to do, at least in the short term?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, as always, is complicated.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at the surface, Hitler's policies, they seem pretty successful.
At least for a while.
Yeah, at first.
Yeah.
Unemployment, it plummeted.
Really?
Yeah. And Germany's industrial output, especially in, armaments, it grew massively.
So from the outside looking in, it looked like he was actually, making Germany great again.
It's what it looked like.
But we know it couldn't last, Right, like there had to be a catch.
Always a catch.
So what was it? What was the price of all this supposed success?
The thing is, the way he achieved this,
Yeah.
it wasn't sustainable.
How so?
Well, for starters, he was basically exploiting people left and right.
Right, because those factories, they weren't exactly churning out consumer goods for the average German, were they?
Nope. It was all about weapons, tanks, planes, the stuff of war.
And the average German citizen. They were stuck with the short end of the stick, right?
Pretty much, they faced shortages of everything. Food, clothing, housing, you name it.
And all in the name of, what, national self-sufficiency. Preparation for a war nobody wanted.
You got it.
It's crazy when you think about it, how he was willing to sacrifice the well-being of his own people.
It's tragic, really.
It really makes you think about the true cost of, these grand economic experiments.
Absolutely. Economic growth means nothing if it comes at the expense of, basic human dignity and well-being.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so we've talked about Nazi Germany.
What a mess.
Let's shift gears to Castro's Cuba. How did his socialist experiment actually play out? Did it yield any, tangible results?
It's actually pretty interesting.
Oh.
Yeah, because on the one hand, Cuba saw some genuinely impressive improvements, especially in social indicators.
Like what? Give me some specifics.
Well, for one, literacy rates went through the roof.
No.
Yeah. And healthcare. It became a right for all Cubans, no matter their background.
Wow, that's a pretty big deal, especially when you consider what things were like before the revolution.
Huge difference.
It sounds like Castro, for all his flaws, he was actually committed to social equality, at least in those areas.
Oh, absolutely. He saw education and healthcare as fundamental rights, not privileges.
And that's commendable, even if his methods were, shall we say, a bit heavy-handed at times.
To say the least.
No.
But you can't argue with the results, right? These investments in education and healthcare, they really did improve the lives of millions of Cubans.
They did. But we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the, shall we say, elephant in the room.
The Soviet Union.
Bingo.
Yeah.
They were pouring resources into Cuba.
Oh, yeah. Tons of financial aid, subsidies, you name it.
It makes you wonder, how much of Cuba's success, at least during that period, was due to Castro's policies versus just like having a really generous sugar daddy.
It's the age-old question, isn't it? Nature versus nurture.
Right. But in this case, it's more like socialism versus Soviet subsidies.
Touché. But seriously, you can't ignore the role of Soviet support in all of this.
Absolutely not.
Because ultimately, Castro's Cuba, even with its achievements, it never really broke free from that cycle of dependence.
Just swapped one benefactor for another in a way.
Exactly.
It's fascinating stuff. So we've got these two leaders both aiming for this, economic utopia in their own way, and both ending up entangled in these complicated webs of dependence. It's like history is a giant game of chutes and ladders.
Uh-huh. I like that.
But seriously, it's clear that these stories are complex. There's no easy answers, no simple heroes or villains.
Definitely not. And that's what makes studying them so fascinating, right? Trying to understand the nuances, the contradictions.
Totally.
Yeah.
So how do historians even begin to make sense of it all?
Well, historians are a diverse bunch.
I've heard.
They approach these regimes from all sorts of angles.
So what are some of the main schools of thought when it comes to, understanding Hitler and Castro's economic policies?
Well, one way to look at it is through the lens of totalitarianism.
Okay, I've heard that term thrown around.
It's a big one for sure.
But what does it actually mean in this context?
Basically, it's about control. Total control.
Control over what?
Everything. The economy, obviously, but also the media, education, even people's personal beliefs.
So in this view, the economic policies we've been talking about, they were just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Exactly. For totalitarian regimes, it's all about consolidating power, suppressing any kind of dissent.
And controlling the economy, that's a pretty effective way to do that, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's about shaping not just how people live, but how they think.
It's a bit chilling when you put it like that. But I imagine not everyone buys into this whole totalitarianism thing, right?
Right.
Especially when it comes to Castro.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Marxist historians, for example, they have a very different take on things, especially when it comes to Cuba.
I bet. They probably see Castro as like a champion of the working class, right?
In a way, yeah. They view his policies as a direct response to, centuries of capitalist exploitation.
Which Cuba definitely experienced.
Oh, yeah. Especially with the whole sugar industry thing. Remember, Cuba was basically a sugar colony for centuries.
Right. So Marxist historians would argue that Castro's decision to, nationalize industries, redistribute land, all that jazz, it was about righting historical wrongs.
Exactly. They see it as an attempt to create a more equitable society, one where the workers controlled the means of production, as Marx himself would say.
So a noble goal, even if the execution was, shall we say, a bit messy.
A bit. But the point is, from a Marxist perspective, Castro's Cuba wasn't about totalitarianism.
It was about liberation.
Exactly. It was about breaking free from the shackles of capitalism and colonialism.
Okay, so we've got two very different interpretations here.
Two sides of the same coin, perhaps.
On the one hand, we've got the totalitarian view, which sees these regimes as inherently oppressive, using economic control as a tool for political domination.
Right.
And on the other hand, we've got the Marxist perspective, which, at least when it comes to Castro, views his actions as a necessary response to historical injustices.
A way to create a more just and equitable society.
It's amazing how two very different lenses can lead to such wildly different interpretations of the same events.
That's history for you. Always up for debate, always open to interpretation.
So we've talked about the totalitarian view, and we've talked about the Marxist view. Are there any other ways to make sense of these regimes? It's always helpful to look at things from multiple angles.
Absolutely. There's another school of thought that I think is particularly relevant here, especially when we're talking about Castro's Cuba. It's called dependency theory.
Dependency theory, huh? I'm not familiar with that one. Tell me more.
So dependency theory argues that countries like Cuba, countries that were former colonies,
Right, with a long history of being economically controlled by more powerful nations.
Exactly. They often struggle to break free from that cycle of dependency, even after they achieve political independence.
So even though Castro overthrew Batista and kicked out those foreign corporations, Cuba was still trapped in this web of economic reliance.
That's the idea. And in Cuba's case, they basically just swapped one overlord for another.
Out with the U.S., in with the Soviet Union.
Right. And as we talked about earlier, that dependence on the Soviets, it made Cuba incredibly vulnerable when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Their lifeline vanished overnight.
Exactly. Cuba was left in a really tough spot. It's a cautionary tale about just how difficult it is to break free from those historical patterns of dependence.
Even when you have a leader who's so gung-ho about, self-determination like Castro, it makes you think.
It does. It highlights how complex and interconnected the global economy really is. It's not as simple as just, declaring yourself independent. There are these deeply ingrained power dynamics at play.
Okay, so let's bring it all home. We've got Hitler and Castro, two very different leaders, different contexts, different ideologies. But both were driven by this idea of autarky, this desire to create these self-sufficient nations. And yet, both ended up entangled in different forms of dependence. What's the takeaway here? What can we learn from these historical parallels?
Well, for me, it underscores the fact that there's no such thing as a truly self-sufficient nation in today's world. We are all interconnected, whether we like it or not. And these historical examples, they really force us to think critically about things like globalization, free trade, the whole shebang.
Right, like can any country truly thrive in isolation, especially in our hyper-connected world?
It's a question worth asking ourselves. And these historical examples, they remind us that the pursuit of absolute self-sufficiency, it often comes with unintended consequences.
And new forms of dependence. It's like a never-ending cycle.
It's about finding that balance, isn't it, between national interest and global cooperation, between self-reliance and interdependence.
Easier said than done, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. But they're questions we can't afford to ignore. These are questions that continue to shape our world today.
It's amazing how these deep dives into the past always seem to reveal these enduring patterns, these echoes of history that just keep reverberating into the present.
Right. It speaks to the power of history, doesn't it? To help us understand not only where we've been, but also where we might be headed. And maybe, just maybe, to help us make more informed choices in the present.
Well said. Well, folks, there you have it. Another deep dive in the books. We've journeyed from the depths of the Great Depression to the sunny shores of Cuba, all in search of answers to some of history's most perplexing questions. And as always, we've only just scratched the surface.
Exactly. There's always more to explore, more to learn, more to debate. That's the beauty of it, right?
Absolutely. So to our amazing listeners, we encourage you to keep those mental gears turning, keep asking those tough questions, keep digging deeper into the mysteries of the past. Until next time, stay curious.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.